Hey, good people. Thank you for tuning in again to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. Hey, I'm still floating. I'm up on cloud nine because last night I did my first ever live podcast event. Because we dropped this 4-part series about my genealogy, we wanted to gather people to have a bit of a talk back. Now, just, in full disclosure, we had planned this release gathering before we dropped the episodes, but we live in Wisconsin. The winter has been crazy, and the night we had planned to do this, schools were closed, a snowstorm was coming in, and we had to reschedule. And so that event took place last night, and it was great. We had a room full of people. I talked a lot about what went into the genealogy research, the conversations that I developed, the relationships of people that are also developing. It was just a great night. We had a black team and a white team, and we played black icebreakers. We had food. It was really, really fun. It makes me think I'm starting to really like live events. So let me just put this out here. If you're from the Madison area and you think it would be fun to gather a group of folks for maybe doing a live podcast recording or talkback, go to alexg.com/contact and talk to me. Let me know what you're thinking. I know that later this week, I'm going to be speaking at the Madison Club, and I'm going to be talking with them about my genealogy research. And this is sort of the downtown, upper muckety muck of where the city gathers. It's a good organization. I sit on their board, but they've asked me to come in and be sort of the cultural speaker this February to talk about my genealogical work. And so maybe you have a service club or an organization, or you want to do something out of a bar or a cafe. You can go to alexg.com/contact and let me know what you're thinking. And hey, if you're in one of our high listening areas, the Bay Area of Northern California, Seattle, Milwaukee, Chicago, hey, if you're thinking Minneapolis, you're thinking, hey, we'd love to have your team come out and maybe do a live event or have a talk back about your genealogy or do a live show, I would love to consider that. So you holler at us too, alexg.com/contact, and let me know what you're thinking. There might be a really cool cultural event that's coming up, and you think that it might be really fun to have me and my team there to do a show, to interact with your clientele, your constituents. I would love to really consider that. There was something very energetic about being in that room last night. Now, I was asked what were some of the major takeaways from both my trips to New Orleans and to Mississippi, to meet two sets of white relatives and to also connect with my black relatives, and we recorded it. And so rather than just trying to give you a recap right now, I'm going to let you listen in on the presentation last night. Again, it was really good, and the energy was high. And it reminded me of what a popular subject genealogy is. So, hey, take a listen and let me know what you think. And if it spurs some questions, you can contact us on Facebook or Twitter, social media. You can go to my website. But shoot your questions, because we probably will have so many questions in response to what we're about to broadcast that we may need more than one episode to answer some of the questions. So don't feel like you can't ask questions because you weren't at this event. We are bringing you to the event by bringing the event to you. Let us know what your questions are. All right, so let's go to last night's event where we were celebrating the drop of this 4-part series on my genealogy project.
You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G, a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Now here's Dr. G.
Come on, sing it, Mark, like you mean it.
Ooh, black like me. Ooh, black like me. Ooh,
it's okay if you're not black. Everybody's black tonight.
Ooh, black like me. Ooh, black like me. Ooh, black like me.
this is a lot different doing this in front of a live audience than it is with just a couple of guys in the studio. But I want to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you so much for being here. We've been looking forward to this. But I just wanted to give you applause for just following us and making sure you got here tonight as well. It means a whole lot. Listen, I'm amazed that so many people are interested in finding out about my story. But this story really isn't mine. It really is, this genealogical study is really a story about America. And it's helping me to understand America differently, and I hope that that's what's happening also. I've got a couple of people that I want to give quick shout-outs to. The Human Family Unity Foundation is the organization that underwrites our production, and I certainly appreciate them. And they love just being somewhat anonymous, so if we could just give them a hand, I'm sure they'll get word about this. And our special partner, WORT FM Radio. They have allowed us to use their studios for Black Like Me for almost an entire year, and I want to just celebrate them.
Dr. G, is there any topic you thought might be used for your show, but then you decided against it?
Oh, yes.
Well, what was it?
Oh my goodness. Oh man. I'm doing most of them. And some of the ones that I've not done, I haven't done it yet. So I don't think that there are any that are off the table.
What have been some of your favorite interviews, like highlights?
I enjoy having folks who've done amazing things, but having them talk about their childhood, their inspiration, just the normalcy of Black excellence. That sometimes people will see folks who are doing great things and they'll say, wow, you're so articulate. Wow, you write well. Like, wow. And just having people who are just doing excellent work and just talk to them about who their heroes were and some of the struggles, but really their joys. Because what it does is it shows how much we have in common, but also things that are just very, very different. And that's what I want people to understand. I don't want them to feel like just because some of us are African American, our worlds are completely different. Some of our experiences are, most of our experiences are, but that's the piece that I really enjoy.
Did you feel unsafe in Mississippi?
Did I feel safe?
Unsafe.
No. I'll tell you what really happened now. Listen to me, Madison folks, all right? I feel like in the South, you know where you stand and where you are. I felt that, at least from James and Marianne, there is a sense of warmth. And then with my cousin David, the gentleman who's standing with me under the street sign, there was a connection with my history that was very powerful. One of my cousins gave me a bag of black eyed peas. And so I want you to they've had them frozen, so I want you to take these back with you, and I want you to eat food that was grown on your family's land.
Wow.
And because we have to drive like 18 hours, they got a little mushy.
So he gave you peas, but didn't give you any acreage?
No, these are, no, they're gonna give me acre, I gotta buy it. But the thing is, the idea that we had land and that we had street signs and it made me want to live there. I came back and I told Jackie, she said, I'm not going back to the South. I came back and I said, Jackie, I looked at a lot. I want a place to go and write or do something, but I left feeling like I wanted to live close to the black relatives and close to the white relatives, because there's questions they want to ask, and they want to feel like somehow there's redemption. Because they've inherited the benefits, but they didn't cause this. Laleda asked Joan, she said, have y'all met black relatives before? Because y'all are not acting shocked. And she broke down and started crying. You remember that? She started crying because she said, so much of my work was with African-American families. As a social worker, I didn't know that I had relatives, that I had this desire to connect, but I didn't know I had relatives. So the more I go to Mississippi, the more I enjoy it. What I really would love to do is I would really like to get some land near one of the G areas and create a center for reconciliation. I want to redeem some of what's happened on there, where I can bring thought leaders together around the country who are looking at issues of reconciliation. Yeah, but no, I did not feel unsafe. I will say this, and I'm still processing it, so that's why I sound tentative, because I don't want to be presumptuous and say too much too soon. But I felt that if something were to go down where I was, that the white G's would not leave me hanging. That's how I felt with the ones who lived there with James and with Mary Ann. There was a genuine connection that I didn't feel like they would be ashamed in front of their other white relatives. And there was something about them that connected me to history that I want to know more about. That was a long answer, but I'm still really processing it. But I did not feel what I, as a Northerner, was told about Mississippi. There are places where I just felt like we were more honest than what we talk about in Northern college, university, capital city towns, where we talk about openness, but then, you still go to places today where they have Black Lives Matter signs, but then you're insulted when you go in to shop, a place you shop for 40 years. I don't expect that in Mississippi. If you don't like me, I'm going to know you don't like me, and I'm going to leave you alone. But don't lure me into your business with your Black Lives Matter sign and then insult me. So that's what's really different.
All right, last question. What next steps are there with your genealogy research and your connections to newfound relatives?
I'm also working to tell this story with video, because I liked some of the interactions and my visual interaction to some of this information. I think the other piece is John's daughter Meg and Lexi are going to appear on podcasts to talk about great granddaughters. I want Meg to talk about what she thinks about her great grandmother, knowing that Reuben was siring all these children, as her great granddaughter. How are you processing that as a woman? And then I want Lexi to talk about the lack of intersectionality between the women's movement and Black suffrage. We've learned last night from Dr. Kantrowitz that the women's suffrage movement really grew out of the race, out of racial suffrage, out of Black suffrage. That Black and white women began to organize around that. But as it really progressed, as the white women found more of their places and in space, Black women were not included in that. So I want Lexi to address some of that history, because if we don't capture that, we are continuing to miss that. There's a lot of lack of intersectionality. And so I think exploring that and talking about how that goes down to the next generation. And I also want to, I think I want to ask John and the family more about their regrets. John talked about the fact that he had help. And he didn't mention that until he came to Madison for an interview. But the woman who took care of him was Black. And so he opened up to me and said this, actually here in the church. We were downstairs in the meeting room. And he said she woke him up every morning, bathed him, and gave him 3 meals. And I asked, how did you move from having a Black woman bathe you, change you, cook 3 meals? How did you grow up to hate her? And he said it was in the water. He said it was what society anticipated. I want to press him more into what happened, both how he leaned into it and how he leaned out of it. But I asked, what did your mother do while this Black woman was cooking for you and, wiping you as what was she doing? He said she was doing puzzles and, crafts, and she was, hosting social events. I said, just like The Help, like the movie The Help? He said, yeah. And I said, so this woman did all of this for you and you grew up to hate Black women like her? And he said, yeah. He said, and my forensics teacher challenged me and just said, you need to stand down, and challenged him. So I want to find out more about that transition, because it's so easy to tell the story, and I'm appreciative of where he is, but I think other white men who have experienced that transition or want to experience that transition need to know the steps. Like, okay, so if it's just reading Black Like Me, then let's prescribe it to everybody. Starting with the White House, let's give it to everybody. Can we put that book into a pill? Can we give that as an injection? Can we drop it on the White House lawn? But I want him to really talk about the steps, because I think people need to understand that. And I think John has a word and a message for white men in Charlottesville. He needs to do more than just say, those poor, misguided, whatever. He has something to say because he understands the rage. And there was an atmosphere where he lived where you could do that kind of stuff. He did come of age in Mississippi in the 50s. But I want John and others who made that transition to talk to white men who have been radicalized around racial issues and ask what the transition was. You know, after our podcast event, we set up a special number so that people could text their questions to us. And Eli, who's my engineer, was going to sleep last night and said he kept hearing his phone vibrate. And people were sending in questions, Eli. You said like 11:30 last night?
Yeah. It was keeping me up.
So the event ended at 7:50, 7:49, 7:50. People must have gone home, talked about it, and still wrote their questions. So that blows me away. I love it. And so we've captured some of these questions that came in last night, or ones that came in during the event. We just didn't have enough time to answer them. So Eli, why don't we just go through some of them, and you can just throw the questions at me, and I'll do as best as I can in answering them.
Great. So this is one that did get asked at the event last night, but we're gonna ask it again. What were you most looking forward to when meeting your white relatives?
Okay, you're right, Eli. I was asked this question last night. I don't know if I would really call this what I was looking forward to, like with some great anticipation, but one of the desired outcomes was to ground myself in reality, that by meeting white people who we shared the same blood in our veins, somehow grounded me to U.S. history, even though it was a very surreal experience, in a more concrete way. So for me, it was sort of a reality check, like this really happened. And these stories of slavery and the atrocity of slavery happen to people who are related to me. Because once that's understood, I can fully celebrate the resilience of my family. So in some strange way, I needed to sort of pinch myself to know that I wasn't dreaming. This stuff really did happen in America, but the trip to New Orleans and Mississippi really just made it more concrete that yes, it happened, and it happened in my family. And so I think I just needed to burst that bubble and just to say, this is part of my history. Then that gives me more energy to really celebrate the resilience and the culture that developed as a result. And I think I was looking forward to getting a better understanding of what reconciliation might look like if you're black and white and part of the same family. It's different if you work in the same office, you're on the same team, you live in the same city. How do you begin to talk about race, and how do you deal with the history when it happened in your collective family? And having that starting point for having a more real dialogue about race with people who were genetically G's, that we're from the same person, place, experiences, that it would help the discussion for me about race to really happen at a very real level, a very powerful level, a very authentic level. And I think I was looking forward to establishing that base and that connection.
Another question is, are you still in regular contact with your white relatives? Do you have plans to see them again anytime soon?
I do. John and I will text and email from time to time. We're working on a video project right now to tell this story. And so he and I will speak about that. I like to go down again. John's very hospitable. He took really good care of us, and we returned the favor when he came to Madison. But each time we talk, I learn more and more about him. Like, it wasn't until I met him in New Orleans, and then he came to Madison maybe 6 months later, and he talked about having help, that there was a black woman who took care of him and his family. That was very intriguing, but I didn't know that when I went to New Orleans. It didn't come up. So I feel like the more we talk, the more our guards come down, and we know we can trust each other, that we're really trying to understand race relations, and I'm not trying to belittle that part of the family or ridicule them. But I've been thinking about New Orleans and Mississippi a lot. So actually, I want to return to New Orleans to visit John, but I want to go back to Mississippi again this year.
Mm-hmm. And I like to remind people that in our genealogy series, there's an episode where you sit down with John here in Madison,
right.
and that was about a year after that original trip to New Orleans.
It was a good conversation. That's actually where, that was the day he revealed to me that they had black help and what that was like. So people really should listen to that episode.
So if there was one thing you could tell your white relatives that you didn't at that time, or you didn't feel you could at that time, what would that be?
Oh my goodness. Okay, let's see. There was the initial shock that we're related, and then the additional shock that we are related and we're in the same space. And I will say this. I consider myself somewhat or very intuitive. I felt the family connection. I can't explain it. It's a strange thing to say, but it was not like walking into the room of some folks who had contracted me to come and speak. It was not a group waiting for a reconciliation meeting. Even though we'd never met before, I felt this sense of family and connection. And so there's a part of me that felt, well, for family, we can have a hard discussion. But then the flip side of that is, we're family, let's not push the envelope all at once. But I think I would have loved to talk to them about how, in their estimation, America became a superpower in the world, and how the South and cotton and sugar and slavery contributed to that. Because it was really America's sense of capitalism that not only created a system called slavery, but it created the reality of slavery, but a system around it, building ships, building barrels for putting meat in so that you could give a high protein diet to slaves in the Caribbean. The farms, the cotton sack, the cloth, and like America, for being in its stages of infancy, became a superpower, a world power so quickly. I think the consensus is we're Americans. We work hard. We pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and we're better than everybody else, frickin' A. That's how it happened, with very little attention being given to the fact. And anyone who runs a business, I run a nonprofit business, understand this. If you zero out the line that says personnel, that has a great impact on your margin, and that helps your bottom line tremendously. I would have had a discussion with them, and we still can, about the connection between American idealism, capitalism, and slavery. And I'd like to juxtapose that with how they learned world history and the history of the U.S. That's something I want to have. That's a conversation I want to have with relatives who understand that not only are we connected by blood, but we're connected economically as well.
Kind of along those same lines, somebody asked, did you hold back anything in that first meeting with them? That you didn't quite feel comfortable sharing? Anything
Partly
specific?
to protect myself, because it's so easy to say. And another thing, but I mean, I'm a student of history, so I understand that these white relatives are the beneficiaries of a very horrific system, and they're still coming to the knowledge of what that system is, the systemic reality of racism. And so, if I just wanted to have one interaction, just an interview, so I could come back and make a podcast, I could have gone in, kicking in the doors and turning the tables over. But I really went down wanting to build a relationship so that the conversation could be ongoing and we could somehow find a way of merging our families or reconnecting our families in a very healthy way. Well, then you approach that like you don't approach that like that's a one-time conversation. You approach it like it's an open-ended, ongoing conversation. And it's when people are committed in relationships and marriage, parent and child, where we're connected. We're not going anywhere, so we can say anything, preferably in love, but we can say anything because we're committed to each other for the long haul. We had not established that commitment yet. So there are things that just weren't appropriate because I want answers, but I think more importantly, I want the answers that come out of relationship and trust. And building that with the descendants of your family slaveholder is just like, even when I say that, I have to keep saying it just to remind myself that that's who they are. That's who this is. That's what this is about. I would also want to ask when they think the attitudes of the majority of whites in where they live in Mississippi changed. Cousin John moved from that region because he didn't like the attitudes of the people. He talks about that himself. He chose not to go to school in Mississippi. And then for grad school, he came up and went to Big Ten school. But I remember asking, how did you have black help and then you became someone who just hated black people? And then you had this switch because you had a forensics teacher that had you read Black Like Me, ironically. But I want to ask more details about the questions. Like, did your peers separate? How did that shape your view of faith? What did your parents say? Who became your new community? And even though you acknowledged all of that, John, did you build meaningful relationships with folks who are black? Or was this an ideal? So those are ongoing conversations I'd love to have with John this summer that I love our team to continue to have, because I feel, and I don't mean this in a trite way, but it feels almost soap opera like or miniseries like, where I'm meeting with people and they're naming folks. They're saying, so when you met John, or when Joan was a social worker, I love that people are identifying the characters, these real life people. And so, yeah, I over time, I'll get a chance to ask more of those questions.
Yeah. So as your listeners may know, you've talked a lot about your mother on this show. You've read some of her poetry, talked about her advice, and also your sort of family dealing with her Alzheimer's with that. And so somebody asked if you've attempted to share your New Orleans trip with your mother.
No. I might have said, Mom, I went to the South to meet some of the relatives. But again, if anyone understands how Alzheimer's disease or dementia works, it's sort of a futile attempt to kind of take people through some of that journey. But I think because I just want her to hear it, I may have said, Mom, I went to Mississippi to meet relatives. But we're probably talking about more things of the day and trying to keep us connected in the day. Although there are things she can talk about from her youth. She can quote poems from childhood. She can name things, songs that she learned in school. But no, I haven't talked to her deeply about this. And again, this is my father's side of the family and not my mother's side. This is the G side.
So you touch on some of this in the genealogy series that's been released, but how has this journey into finding your relatives changed you? Somebody asked.
It has certainly upped my game as a person who addresses issues of racial disparity. It's one thing to talk about it theoretically. It's another thing to look at it through the lens of your own family, your own DA, and Ancestry.com. It's a much different process when you know the individuals. I was thinking about this last night, Eli. I was thinking, many African Americans know this about their families, but what folks said who came to the event last night is, but we don't know where to start. We know that this happened in this part of Mississippi, but we lost records. We don't know where to go. Where do you start? And so I realized I'm very fortunate. Although I've had an interest in genealogy since I was a teenager, since the mid-'70s, when Alex Haley's Roots came out. I posted one thing on Ancestry.com, hit the mother lode, with John responding to me within 12 hours. And then we communicated. Next thing I knew, I was in New Orleans. And it doesn't happen that way for everyone. People have been looking and searching for folks. So I think over the years I had names and places so that I knew to put Henderson G in the search engine. And that's someone that John was looking for. And so at least I knew my great grandfather's name. It's engaged a conversation with G's like around Wisconsin who have not really looked back to Mississippi. Many of my cousins my age would spend summers in Mississippi. Their parents were born in Mississippi. Their parents were actually educated at the Carthage school that we talked about. Like in part of the presentation, people will have heard by listening to this podcast how the G's donated land for the building of the school. Well, I've got relatives whose parents graduated from that school and went to college at Jackson State and moved to Milwaukee for work. So the history is very, very real, but for a lot of them, they don't want to look back. There are some folks, some family members who don't think I should be doing this because I'm going to bring up painful things of the past. But I'll say that I've been meeting black relatives that from time to time, Tyler will say, a woman wrote you on your website and said, here's her name, and she's a relative. So I have a cousin named Ed from Memphis, and really accomplished. He's a lawyer. He studied at a naval academy, and just seemed like a really fun guy. So on my way home from Mississippi, it was a long drive, I'd forgotten where Ed lived. Henderson is his great-great-grandfather also. Wrote him and said, hey, we got to connect sometime. I had a great trip in Mississippi. I got to tell you about it. And he said, yeah, I want to come and visit Madison. My son is considering Madison for college. And I said, where do you live again? Are you in I mentioned Virginia or something. He said, no, I'm in Tennessee. And I was 15 minutes from where his office was. So he gave me instructions. I got a chance to meet him. So I love meeting the black relatives as well, because it's reminding me that even though Henderson was a slave, his great-great-grandchildren are going to engineering school, naval academies, earning doctorates and JDs, studying abroad, traveling the world, buying homes, building homes. They're doing really, really well. So the more I study Henderson, the more I want to meet his great-great-grandchildren. But the more I look at the accomplishments of his great-great-grandchildren, the more I get a sense of who he must have been and what he must have hoped for. That is extremely affirming. And I think the only thing that helps me to stay sane and sober by looking at all of this is to focus on the resilience of African-American people, the way that my relatives built culture, the way they overcame the hardships of life. But to see Henderson's great-great-grandchildren doing some of the things that Ed and Sam and Edward and other relatives that I have are doing, it's really, really amazing. So at some point, I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to have some historians come in and talk about the period of time in which Henderson was born. But I'd also like to talk with some sociologists, black sociologists, about the sociological impact of slavery. There's new discussions around the epigenetic reality of trauma that's passed to descendants through DNA or some other means. I think that there's so much around this that I want to continue talking about. But I want to go deeper with the white relatives because they were very warm. Marianne and James were very warm down in Mississippi. But I also want to get to know Ed and his family. I want to find the black relatives so that we can collectively tell Reuben's story by telling what we've done and what has motivated us.
So, sort of in light of this whole journey, and really how also in the series you talk about how this reflects sort of the conditions currently in the U.S.
Yes.
and also American history in general, and sometimes the history that's not being told to most people. So somebody asked, what do you hope for in the future in light of all these things?
I hope that we take history more seriously. I know that many universities have adopted what's called an ethnic studies requirement, but that's not always historical. It could be just talking about the uniqueness of an ethnic group. My approach, my organization's approach, the way Nehemiah and Justified Anger go about training white allies is to look at U.S. history and what was happening to and amongst black people during that period of time. Because to talk about slavery and to not talk about sugar and plantations would be erroneous. To talk about slavery and not talk about the invention of the cotton gin or the world's desire for cotton and sugar and how sugar just changed everything, and the systems and the dollars that were raised around it, it's hard to understand the impact because slavery is gone, but the systems that were built by it are not gone. I sort of use this analogy. It's a crude one, but I love Seattle, and the Space Needle is a part of Seattle's skyline, but it's a residual effect of the World's Fair. That when the World's Fair happened in Seattle, they built the needle, and so it stays. But people think of it as just being Seattle, but it's the World's Fair leaves something like that every place it goes. So the fair is gone, but there's still residual effects of it, and it's the Space Needle. It's not a bad thing; it's beautiful, but it's still there. That's what's happened with systemic racism. We identify it solely with slavery, but realizing that when slavery ended, there were things that were built, systems that were built that are still there, that are part of the landscape and the skyline that we just assume is Southern American, Northern, educational, economic, societal, and it's not. It's really a residual impact of slavery. And race-based slavery. So I'm hoping for a realistic glance at history, a study of history for adults and youth, because the whole discipline of history in part exists so that we don't repeat it, at least not the bad parts of it. Yeah. And I think we assume that we're kind and smart enough to not do what our ancestors have done. But if we don't look at why and how they made the mistakes that they do, we unwittingly participate in systems set up by people during that period of time that still has the power to hold people captive today, and we don't recognize it as such. So I think we need a deep, deep look at history before we can have a really good look at our future. And so I want us to look back, not for the sake of being divisive or stuck, but for understanding that if we miss this opportunity to address issues, we will repeat the mistakes of people 100 to 300 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that by looking at history, we can begin to build bridges to each other and coalition and have honest dialogues and find meaningful ways to connect and work on solutions together. That's really the core of my work, that we look back at history in order to avoid pitfalls that will enable us to build stronger relationships that will lead to social capital and social cohesion that allows people who have normally been separated to build solutions together because they have a mutual vested interest. They've built a sense of trust. They have not just focused on their differences, but their similarities. And I think it is in building and rebuilding these relationships. We call it social cohesion. A friend shared an article with me from the New York Times that calls it weaving. But it's the brokenness of relationships and the lack of trust that has opened America to the wound of greater polarization. As we begin to love and respect and trust each other, our conversations and our interactions take on a different tone, and we let everyday people build solutions rather than what we're doing now, hoping that one candidate, one business, one foundation, one government can do it. We've tried that, and it can't happen. The beauty of the civil rights movement was that it was relationships, having an impact on policies, on practices, and changing people's personal interaction and perspectives of each other. I trust that you've enjoyed this episode. I know that I have. It's really interesting to me how things come full circle. My interest in roots and Alex Haley's writings in 77, and now I'm still talking about genealogy almost 40 years later is quite amazing. But it's helping me to just think about my world differently, and I hope that you are as well. So I want to say to my local friends who came out in the snow and the cold, in the February cold, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast event. For those of you who are listening, thank you, because you're helping us to continue this, and thank you that you're participating in it as well. We took as many questions as we could in this segment, but keep the questions coming, because as you might have guessed, we're not through talking about this topic. And so continue to send your questions or your thoughts, and we would really, really appreciate it. This has been another really exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. I love what I do, and I love that you listen to what I do. You're a big part of why we do this. So please subscribe. Tweet out that you're listening. Use social media to share this story. You know someone who's either interested in genealogy or found some interesting things out about genealogy. Share this episode, share the series, share the podcast with them. All right. Have a great day, and thank you again for being a part of Black Like Me.